All right, now for more on this, we are joined in by Richard Kimber, who's joining us live from Hong Kong. Richard, let me begin by asking you this. This, in many ways, was being seen as a fait accompli. The minute Beijing had decided to introduce this very controversial security law. But give us a sense of what it actually means for Hong Kong. Does it mean the end of Hong Kong as we know it?
Well, certainly the government is saying absolutely not. They're saying that this law will just stabilise society here and that the idea of the two systems concept will very much remain and that Hong Kong will retain much of its autonomy that it's become used to. That's not a line that is being believed, frankly, by many of the pro-democracy activists here, and that's why there's expectations that even though the law has now formally been passed, there will still be protests tomorrow and ongoing to try and oppose the idea of this law, even though, as I say, it will already have been passed by the time the protests begin tomorrow. The specific detail that's frustrating so many people here from the pro-democracy camp is the lack of detail, because although the bill has been passed in China now, it's not until this afternoon, after of course it's been passed, that a full version of the text of the law will eventually be made public. That's due to be made public by the Chinese state media agency, the Xinhua agency. So later this afternoon, finally, everybody in Hong Kong, both the public and even many politicians and members of the judiciary, will finally be able to see the specific text, and that will help everybody here understand more clearly how the bill can be implemented and the likely scenarios under which prosecutions may be made.
Right, and also give us some clarity in terms of the technical aspects of this present law that has now been passed by Beijing. Does it need to be ratified by the legislature in Hong Kong, or does it simply override the Hong Kong legislature?
Basically, the answer is no, it doesn't. So all that will happen later this afternoon is the law will be handed to Hong Kong and it will then be signed into the Hong Kong common law by the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam. There's a process called gazetting, whereby the law is actually literally written into the Hong Kong Gazette law, a manual as such. And that at that point, then it will finally become proper Hong Kong law. And because of that simple process, the Chief Executive here, given the chance to talk about it this morning at her press briefing, actually refused to comment, despite being asked multiple times by many journalists what her thoughts on this passing in Beijing are. She just refused to comment outright and said only after it has actually been fully implemented into Hong Kong law will she be in a position to talk about it. So the expectation is that will happen later today, such that tomorrow, the National Day, as you've mentioned earlier, the law will come into effect. That, of course, is a public holiday here, and that's a day that has long been used by pro-democracy groups to try and campaign for more democracy, more autonomy in Hong Kong, dating all the way back to the handover. So even though protests have been banned this year by the police, citing coronavirus social gathering restrictions as meaning that protests cannot take place, there's still an expectation that many people will come out tomorrow, since it's a national holiday, to show their opposition to this law, even though, effectively, it's too late. The law has already been passed.
Absolutely, indeed. And I also want you to weigh in a bit on the contrast from last year, when Beijing had wanted to introduce the very controversial extradition bill. That, of course, was scrapped eventually, but the security bill has now become a law. Do we expect the kind of protest that we saw last year, or does it mean that we're going to see fewer protests, because we're also seeing stuff like Joshua Wong having resigned from his party? What is the sense that you're picking up on the ground? Will people come out like last year and protest on the streets of Hong Kong?
Well, if you look at many of the pro-democracy groups, they're certainly still calling for people to come out, encouraging people to come out. On Sunday here, there were smaller protests encouraging people to still gather on July the 1st. Everybody really treats July the 1st as a very important pro-democracy rally event, irrespective of what might be happening in politics. It's a tradition almost to come out and voice ideas about having more autonomy in Hong Kong. So it's a very important day. As to what can really happen, now that's difficult, because for the first time, police have outright banned a protest. That means there's no single organised march taking place as usual, for example, at a specific time in a specific place. That makes it hard for protesters to have the confidence to know that they're coming out in large numbers. Also, the police have already said that they plan to crack down relatively quickly on large gatherings tomorrow in a way that they have not done so before on July the 1st gatherings, which again is sowing seeds of uncertainty on the part of individuals here who might want to protest but are now not sure whether it's a good idea. And because the new law will have effectively kicked in by tomorrow morning, there's also concerns about the possibility of people being arrested under this law because they're coming out to protest, whereas previously this would not have been a concern. So it's difficult to imagine that we'll see scenes like we saw last year, because so many people here are now genuinely concerned about the effects of what might happen if they do come out and protest. But there's so much frustration, I certainly expect that at least tomorrow we'll still see large groups of people. But whether it will escalate in the way that it did last year, where you had protesters breaking into Hong Kong government headquarters and vandalising the debating chamber, that seems fairly unlikely, because the police presence already has been said to be much higher tomorrow than it certainly was at the beginning of the protest events last year.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Richard Kimber, for joining us from Hong Kong and getting us all those insights in terms of what is happening there. Tomorrow, of course, remains a very, very crucial day, where the controversial bill has now been turned into a law, and the ramifications of this will, of course, have a far-reaching impact for Hong Kong.